that's what they want. They just want the impression of the United States looking generous, but not having to actually fulfill. Kind of like, hey, we're going to give you 31 tanks, but we can't get them, until 2024. Hey, at least they had good intentions and tried, right? Mark Milley, he said in that same conference that Russia, their military is making mindless moves with vast numbers of untrained soldiers. There could be some truth to that, but it does seem that Russia has become significantly more organized in the last 90 to 120 days. Is he using old intel, or is there some truth to what he's saying?
No, there's no truth to what he's saying. It's not even that he's using old intel. What's happening right now, and it's happening across the board, is what I call mirror imaging, meaning that Ukraine is right now in a state of imminent collapse. Their military is becoming virtually dysfunctional, and one of the reasons is they're running out of manpower. So Ukraine is going around and literally kidnapping people off the streets, including 14 and 16-year-old boys who are showing up on the front line with 3 days of training. So they're kidnapped from the streets of Odessa, given 3 days of training. They end up in Bakhmut and they die. This is happening in massive numbers. This is a public relations problem for the Ukrainians. So what we're doing is we're mirror imaging the problems of Ukraine onto the Russians. But the Russians aren't doing that. The Russians mobilized 300,000 men in September. The vast majority of those men are still undergoing training. So the notion that these are poorly trained troops is just absurd in the extreme. These were military reservists who already had served in the military, had a modicum of experience, and instead of being thrown straight into the fight, they're being sent to a training area where for now September, October, November, December, January, February, we're coming up on 7 months of training to get them ready to form on the battlefield. So, Mark Milley is just making this up. It's not what's happening. The Russians are extraordinarily well equipped. They have modern equipment, modern tanks, modern artillery. They have body armor. They have everything they need, and they're trained to do this job. These are not poorly trained troops, and they're not throwing them in human wave assaults. The fact of the matter is that the casualty ratio right now is insane. Normally in a war, the offense versus defense is you want a 3-to-1 advantage from the offense and defense, because generally speaking, you're going to take more casualties than a defender. So you need that kind of advantage. The Russians right now are, operating with parity in numbers when it comes to infantry, but superiority in numbers when artillery. But on the casualty ratio, they're killing Ukrainians sometimes as high as 16-to-1 in a day. Sometimes it drops down to 10, sometimes it drops down to 8. But what that means is if you, on the best day the Ukrainians are having, for every 800 Ukrainians that die, they're killing 100 Russians. But on the worst day, for every 100 Russians that die, 1,600 Ukrainians die. And the Ukrainians are having a lot of bad days, not so many good days, but even their good day is a nightmare. It's Ukraine that's chewing through its troops at a rate that's unimaginable. And I think it was Lloyd Austin that threw out a number, casualty number of 100,000. I think during the same presentation, talked about 100,000 dead. But he knows that's a lie. He knows that he was reported to by General Zaluzny of the Ukrainian army last month that Ukraine had suffered close to 250,000 dead, on top of which there are 83,000 missing, most of whom are dead, which means that Ukraine has suffered around 320,000 dead. That's the honest number. But Lloyd Austin can't be honest about that because that's a number that just boggles the mind. If you look at the combatant losses of the United States in World War II, in both the Pacific Front and the European Front, we didn't lose 320,000 dead. We lost fewer than that in terms of combatant deaths, people who die in combat. The Ukrainians have lost 320,000 combatant deaths in 1 year. That's a ridiculous number. That's a sickening number. And it reflects the reality of what's going on the ground in Ukraine today. And Lloyd Austin and Mark Milley can't be honest about that, because if they were, American people would say, then we need to bring this war to an end, because this is just resulting in the death of people that we claim to be supporting.
The United States, this is a humanitarian crisis now, and that they owe it to Eastern Europe to switch gears and sue for peace and withhold weapons and support until they seek peace. But for some reason, they continue to defer to Zelensky to decide, when is there peace? When is this over? What does winning and losing look like? How much money and weapons do you need? Why is the United States continuing to give Zelensky so much authority over this war when it's obvious that it's the United States and the United Kingdom and Germany and Poland driving the majority of the rhetoric and the equipment into the war?
That's a very good question. To answer that, we have to understand the quality of the advice being given to the President of the United States. You know, right off the bat, when you have senior people admitting that the policy was regime change, that we wanted to put in sanctions and create political pressures to bring down Vladimir Putin, it tells you two things. One, there is a very strong anti-Putin animus existent in the U.S. government. And two, there's a level of ignorance about Russia that is mind-boggling. I'm not going to brag, but back in December, I said, if we implement these sanctions, Russia will emerge stronger, intact, and it will be the Western economies that begin to collapse. I was proven 100% correct. Why? Because I have taken the time to study Russia, and understand the realities of their economy. But to do that, I have to cut through the fiction that's been put up there about, for instance, that Russia is a nation ruled by one man, Vladimir Putin, the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-evil dictator who controls everything, instead of recognizing the reality that Russia is a very large country where control has been delegated to regional authorities who manage their individual regions, who come together using a bureaucracy to create a consolidated, unified policy that's then taken up to Putin, who oversees it, as a manager, as the chief executive, but not as a dictator. If you understand what I say is the reality, then you're able then to take the time to read the position papers that are put out there. The Russians are telling us what they're doing. They don't lie. They are a very transparent society. Their budget is published. The documents that are used to create that budget are published, and people need to take the time to read that. But if you do that, then it takes away your ability to say, well, Vladimir Putin is the personification of evil. Because if you take the time to study Russia and learn Russia, you realize he's just a very effective manager of a very complex and expansive, nation. Joe Biden is surrounded by what I call the Putin whisperers. This is a group of people who came into academic maturity at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the decade of the 1990s, when the goal of the United States was to keep Russia down, to weaken it economically, control it politically, and if necessary, to break it up into constituent parts that would forever keep it weak and never able to rise up and challenge the United States in the way that the Soviet Union had done during the Cold War. These are people like Michael McFaul, Fiona Hill, Angela Stent, and others who, have written their PhD thesis on authoritarian rule and Vladimir Putin. These are people who supported Boris Yeltsin's government and are resentful that Putin emerged from the post-Yeltsin period to try and unify Russia and make Russia strong again, which he has done. Whether you like Putin or you dislike Putin, you have to acknowledge that he has taken Russia out of, the swamp that Boris Yeltsin had created in the post-Gorbachev, post-Perestroika era, and he has taken Russia up to be one of the strongest and most resilient economies. People talk about infrastructure. In the United States, of course, we have concerns about infrastructure. We have rail cars derailing, we have bridges collapsing, etc. People don't like to talk about the fact that Vladimir Putin has just succeeded in expanding the Russian subway around Moscow. And if you go on the subway, will put anything New York City has to shame instantly. The totality of the Russian subway. It's modern, it's clean, it's efficient, it's everything we would want our infrastructure to be, and everything we claim the Russian infrastructure can't be, because if he's a dictator ruling over this dysfunctional country, how could they possibly produce that? But the Russians produce a lot of good things. It's a nation that's on the rise. And I'm not saying that because I want to sing its praises. I'm saying it because that's real. You can't solve a problem unless you first accurately define the problem. Because any solution you come up to a problem that's not accurately defined isn't a solution at all. It's nothing. To discuss Russia as a problem, we have to describe it accurately, and it can't be described accurately if you're putting everything on the shoulders of Vladimir Putin and you're trying to describe him as this evil character, which of course all senior Americans doing, whether they're in the Pentagon or they're in the White House or they're in Congress, you will not see a single person say what I just said about the reality of Russia. Instead, Congress holds hearing after hearing where they bring in these Putin whisperers who say over and over again about how bad Russia is, how poorly it performs, how dysfunctional it is, and how dictatorial Vladimir Putin is. That's just not the truth.
Yeah. Putin and politicians. Yesterday, Senator Lindsey Graham called for the U.S. military to start shooting down Russian warplanes anytime they enter international waters. This is his reaction to the Russian fighter jet taking down the Reaper drone over the Black Sea. What kind of repercussions would there be for the United States if we start shooting down Russian warplanes?
Well, the potential for all-out war. I mean, Russia's not going to let that happen. They would challenge us militarily, and then we would end up in a force-on-force conflict that neither side can afford to back down from. So it turns into total war, and then that has the potential of turning into a nuclear exchange, and then this conversation is moot because we're going to be dead. That's what Lindsey Graham needs to understand, and that's what the people who listen to Lindsey Graham need to understand. He's a very dangerous man right now. I know he's a United States senator. I know he's allowed to speak his mind and, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that people who are listening to him should treat what he's saying as if it is the truth. He is speaking in a very dangerous manner. First of all, he said that he implied that Ronald Reagan would never allow something like this to happen. Well, with all due respect, Lindsey Graham, I was in the military as a Soviet expert during the Reagan administration, and we let it happen all the time because, the idea of flying provocative mission profiles with aircraft or with ships didn't begin today. And people should be under no, misconception here. What we did with the Reaper was a provocation. We took an intelligence collection platform, flew it in an area that the Russians know, that we know is very sensitive to Russia, right off the coast of the Crimea Peninsula, one of the most heavily militarized areas in Russia, during a time of war when the United States has a history of collecting intelligence, giving it to Ukrainians so they can target the Russians. So the fact that we're flying an intelligence collection profile in support of Ukraine along the Russian coast is in itself an act of war. This isn't a peaceful exercise. We are being provocative, deliberately so. Two, the Russians have created an exclusion zone and have announced that to the United States, saying that you cannot fly in this area because we have sensitive military activity taking place. That is required under international law. But what we're saying is that because Crimea is Ukrainian, not Russian, the Russians illegally occupied it, Russia has no ability to put an exclusion zone in on what is Ukrainian territory, so we disregarded it. So we sent a $32 million aircraft into this exclusion zone with a sensitive intelligence collection pod, collecting intelligence that when it's returned will be given to the Ukrainians to plan military operations against the Russians. And we're shocked that the Russians put the plane down. So Lindsey Graham is wrong. Marco Rubio, who also came out and spoke about this, is wrong. This wasn't the United States innocently trying to exercise freedom of navigation. This was the United States carrying out a purposefully provocative operation that makes the United States an active participant in an ongoing conflict. And so if you see it in that perspective, you realize what we did was horribly irresponsible. And now Lindsey Graham is talking about escalation by bringing in, manned fighter aircraft in a way that's designed to create a force-on-force incident with the United States and Russia. This is bad policy. Fortunately, I don't see the Pentagon or the White House going down this path because there are saner minds out there than Lindsey Graham or Marco Rubio.
Okay, so they're going to be ignored.